December 13th, 1943. Assam, India. Dawn had barely broken over the humid jungle when the quiet over Dinjan airfield was shattered by a single radio call. Multiple bandits, many heading your way. Only one American fighter was in the sky. Only one pilot was strapped into a cockpit. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair, 89th Fighter Squadron, flying a P-40N Warhawk he had affectionately named Lulu Belle. He wasn't supposed to be alone. Patrol flights were staggered, shared, rotated. But maintenance delays and weather gaps created a perfect moment of vulnerability. Adair had taken off minutes earlier to test an engine adjustment and accidentally became the only defensive screen for the entire sector. At 12,000 feet, he saw them. A formation so large it looked like a dark storm front rolling above the jungle canopy. 24 key, 21 Sally bombers in immaculate formation, flanked by 40 key, 43 Oscar fighters, all moving toward Dinjan. Home to vital fuel depots, repair shops, and the C-47 transports that kept the hump airlift alive. The radio channels were dead. No backup, no wingmen, no time. Every second brought the Japanese formation closer to his base, and to a potential catastrophe that could cripple operations in India and China. Adair leveled the P-40's nose, drew a breath, and pressed the throttle forward. He didn't have the luxury of choosing caution. He didn't have orders. He just had a decision: engage alone, or watch the largest Japanese attack force the region had seen tear apart everything below him. He climbed toward the bombers, knowing he had only one advantage: surprise. For a brief, critical moment, the Japanese formation assumed he was part of a larger flight. They hadn't yet understood the truth. A single American fighter was charging at 64 enemy aircraft, and that was exactly what Philip Adair wanted. Adair pushed Lulu Belle into a steep climb, angling toward the bomber's unprotected underside. The P-40N Warhawk was tough, stable, and built like a flying anvil. Exactly the kind of aircraft that could survive a reckless attack. And reckless was the only option. At 15,000 feet, he rolled inverted, pulled through, and dropped directly into the bomber stream. The Japanese formation scattered in shock. Gunners swung their Type 92 machine guns upward in confusion. No American pilot attacked from below, not alone. The manual said it was suicide. Adair didn't care. He lined up a shot. A key, 21 Sally filled his gun sight, silver belly glinting in the morning sun. He squeezed the trigger. The Warhawk's 6.50 caliber guns erupted, shaking the entire cockpit. Tracer lines stitched across the bomber's fuselage. Smoke burst from its starboard engine. The bomber dropped out of formation, spiraling downward. But the moment he broke through the formation, everything changed. The Oscar escort realized the truth. There was only one American fighter, and they swarmed. Adair punched through the gap, diving hard. Tracers ripped past his canopy. A pair of Oscars latched onto his tail, firing in controlled bursts. The Warhawk's cockpit shook from hits. A warning light flickered, then another. He rolled, dove, climbed, every maneuver he knew, chaining them together in a frantic rhythm. But it wasn't enough. A burst of fire tore through his right wing. Another shattered part of his tail section. Then he felt it. The Warhawk jerked sharply left. Controls lagged. The stick felt mushy. Something was very wrong. More impacts hammered the fuselage. Adair caught a glimpse of a bomber's dorsal turret firing at him as he passed beneath its shadow, friendly or not. Every gun was aimed his way. A second later, a spray of metal fragments whipped through the cockpit. Cables snapped like whiplashes. The right aileron froze. The P-40 dipped. Then the nose dropped hard. Lulu Belle pitched forward into a dive he hadn't commanded. Not a maneuver, a failure. The manuals said what to do next. Every instructor at Luke Field had drilled it into him. Controls severed? Bailout. Don't try to fly a wounded fighter. It will kill you. But as the ground rose fast beneath him, Adair realized something none of those instructors had ever faced. He wasn't over empty desert. He wasn't over friendly territory. He was over enemy ground, and his base, his people, were still in danger. Bailing out meant letting Dinjan burn. He refused. The jungle canopy rushed up toward him, a green blur filling the windscreen as Lulu Belle plunged at nearly 400 miles per hour. Alarm screamed. The stick rattled uselessly in Adair's hand, and the P-40 shuddered like it was being torn apart. He knew this situation by heart. At Luke Field, instructors had shown photos of wrecked aircraft. Fighters with severed cables, jammed control surfaces, twisted ailerons. They repeated the lesson endlessly, drilling it as gospel. A control failure in a single-engine fighter is fatal. Bail out immediately. Don't fight the airplane. But those instructors had never been alone over Assam, with 64 enemy aircraft heading straight for their base. Adair wasn't thinking about regulations. He was thinking about Dinjan. 14C. 47 transports were parked on the field. Lifelines for the hump airlift. Crews were preparing fuel drums, medical cargo, radio equipment. If the Sally bombers reached the airfield, those C-47s would be destroyed, cutting a major artery between India and China. His squadron would be hit on the ground. His friends, his mechanics, men who trusted him to keep the enemy off their backs. He tightened his grip on the stick. He wasn't leaving. The P-40 continued to nose down uncontrollably, but Adair forced himself to analyze, not panic. Pilots died in spirals of fear, not spirals of metal. Something about the way the Warhawk behaved didn't match what he'd been taught. The right aileron was jammed, but the left still moved slightly. Elevators responded barely. Rudder tension felt uneven, but not dead. The plane wasn't broken, not completely. It was simply flying in a way the manual never described. He leveled his breathing. If the standard controls were gone, then the standard rules didn't apply. He glanced at the engine gauges. Still strong. He tested small inputs, rudder, throttle, trim tabs. The P-40 wobbled, but each response told him more than fear ever could. Maybe this wasn't impossible. At 2,000 feet, he steadied the dive using nothing but throttle and trim. It was sloppy, unstable, and dangerous. But it worked. He pulled the nose up, slowly, fighting the Warhawk for every inch of sky. The jungle fell away again. He wasn't out of danger, not even close. The controls were shredded. Japanese fighters were still hunting him, and Dinjan airfield was still in the crosshairs. But Philip Adair had just discovered something no instructor had ever taught. A damaged aircraft still obeys the laws of aerodynamics, if you understand what laws it has left, and he intended to use them. Adair steadied Lulu Belle at barely 500 feet, the P-40 wobbling and twitching like a wounded animal. Every instinct screamed at him to level out, gain altitude, get stable. But stability was gone. The fighter no longer behaved like any P-40 he had ever flown. He tested the stick again. Nothing. The right aileron was frozen solid, shot through its hinge. The elevator cables were frayed, responding in slow, uneven lurches. The rudder felt unpredictable, one moment sluggish, the next overly sensitive depending on airflow. But something did still work, the trim tabs. Most pilots use trim as a convenience. Fine-tuning, easing control pressure, smoothing a climb or glide. No one had ever been taught to fly entirely on trim. No one had ever needed to. But with Adair, it was all he had. He adjusted the elevator trim wheel, slowly, carefully. The Warhawk's nose drifted up by a few degrees. A correction on the rudder trim shifted the wing level, compensating for the jammed aileron. It wasn't elegant flying. It wasn't even proper flying. It was brute force aerodynamics. Each movement took seconds to register. Each overcorrection threatened to send the aircraft skidding sideways into a stall. He coaxed the P-40 into a shallow climb, fighting the natural roll toward the jammed aileron. Behind him, the sky was strangely empty. The Oscars weren't chasing. They had no reason to. From their perspective, the American fighter was finished. A P-40 diving toward the jungle with a jammed aileron didn't survive. It didn't pull up. It didn't climb away. As far as they were concerned, Adair was already dead. But he wasn't just alive, he was climbing. The radio crackled with distant chatter, barely decipherable. Ground observers at Dinjan reported the Japanese formation closing in. The Sally bombers had begun their descent toward the base. Sirens were sounding. Mechanics were scrambling to move the C-47s. Adair looked toward the horizon. 43 miles. If he could keep the P-40 in the air long enough. If he could bring it back toward friendly ground, he might at least draw some attention away from the base. He set a course using only rudder pressure and subtle throttle adjustments. The Warhawk yaw drifted, corrected, drifted again. Every minute was a fight. He wasn't flying a fighter anymore. He was flying a damaged glider with an engine bolted to the front. But he was flying, and that meant Dinjan wasn't lost. Yet, the jungle changed after the third week. The Japanese no longer tested the Marines with mass charges. They probed instead, silent, patient, deliberate. Men began disappearing from listening posts. Rifles were found on the ground. No sign of the owners except a drag mark in the soil and a snapped vine. George spent most nights awake, listening to the forest breathe. The Springfield lay beside him, cool, reliable, an extension of his pulse. He no longer thought of it as a civilian tool. It had become something else. An answer to a question the Pacific asked every evening. One night, just before dawn, a single shot cracked from the tree line. Not loud, sharp, flat clipped. Marines ducked automatically. George didn't. He recognized the signature. Japanese sniper. High in a tree. Close. The camp froze. No one moved to raise their head. Everyone waited. George stood. He studied the black wall of trees. The shot had come from a ridge overlooking the camp, maybe 90 yards out. Hidden perfectly. Only the muzzle flash betrayed anything, and even that was a wisp. He lifted the rifle. For 10 seconds, nothing existed except the forest. He slowed his breathing. He watched for the smallest rhythm, a sway, a shimmer of leaves not caused by the wind. There, third tree from the left, a shape too still. He squeezed the trigger. The echo rolled across the ridge. Then, after a long moment, something soft fell through branches and hit the undergrowth with a sound that was unmistakable. The Marines exhaled. Someone whispered, "How the hell did he even see that?" George didn't answer. He only chambered another round. Word of the shot traveled through the battalion. Command quietly noted that the strange young lieutenant with a hunting rifle was performing well beyond expectations. They didn't say it aloud, but something was shifting. The Marines were beginning to depend on a weapon they didn't issue and a man they didn't fully understand. Later that afternoon, when the heat was rising from the mud in shimmering sheets, a runner arrived with new orders. Japanese snipers had taken positions along a supply trail. Casualties were mounting. Every attempt to clear them had ended the same way. One Marine wounded or killed before the sniper melted away. They wanted George. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his pack, adjusted the sling on his rifle, and nodded to his spotter. The walk would be long, the foliage thick, and the enemy patient. That didn't worry him. He had grown up hunting creatures far more cautious than men. He moved into the jungle, every step deliberate, every breath quiet as paper. Behind him, the Marines watched him disappear into the canopy, and one of them said what they were all thinking. That man isn't fighting the war the rest of us are fighting. He's hunting. George and his spotter, Corporal Jensen, advanced along the narrow supply trail cut through the undergrowth. The air was swamp-heavy, buzzing with insects that never seemed to sleep. The canopy above trapped the humidity like a lid, turning every breath into warm, sticky pressure. The trail itself was a tunnel, dense walls of ferns, creepers, and banyan roots rising on both sides. Perfect terrain for snipers. Terrible terrain for everyone else. They found a first body 15 minutes in. A Marine private lay slumped against a tree, helmet off, a neat hole above his left eye. The blood had dried into a dark crust. His rifle lay across his lap, untouched. Jensen swallowed hard. George crouched beside the corpse and examined the angle of the wound, the position of the body, even the pattern of flies. He wasn't looking at the dead man. He was reconstructing the moment. He fired from high ground. George murmured, above the trail, maybe 40, 50 feet up. Good camouflage, too. Private never saw him. Jensen scanned the treetops, nervously. Think he's still here? George shook his head. No, this one doesn't shoot twice from the same place. They moved on. Every few yards, George would stop, study a broken branch, a bent stalk of kanai grass, the unnatural absence of birdsong. His eyes weren't searching randomly. They were decoding. The jungle was a language, and he understood it fluently. Eventually, they reached an open patch of trail where the canopy thinned. Sunlight filtered through in sharp, golden beams that looked almost out of place in the muddy green gloom. Jensen hesitated, instinctively knowing open spaces were danger zones. George lifted a hand. Snipers watching this clearing. Jensen's pulse spiked. Where? George raised his rifle, but didn't shoulder it yet. His gaze drifted to the left ridge, a steep rise covered in gnarled ironwood trees and hanging vines. He narrowed his eyes. There, he whispered. See the vine on that trunk? The very thin one that's twitching. Jensen stared. He saw nothing. That's his hide, George said. He moved just enough to disturb it. He raised the Springfield, exhaled slowly, and fired. The crack echoed through the jungle. Then, faintly, they heard a body slip from wood, crashing through branches before landing with a heavy, wet thud. Jensen stared at George in disbelief. How did you even spot that? George didn't lower the rifle. His voice was low, almost distant. People think snipers win by shooting. They don't. They win by seeing. He stepped forward into the clearing, scanning for the next threat. Come on, he said. There's more. The trail narrowed again as they pushed deeper into the interior, the kind of tight, twisting corridor that forced men in a single file. Exactly what an experienced sniper wanted. Even the jungle noise felt muted now, as if every creature sensed something lethal nearby. The heat pressed against them like a weight. George stopped suddenly. Jensen bumped into him. What? What do you see? George didn't answer at first. His eyes traced the ground, then the foliage on the right side, then a patch of earth that looked slightly too smooth. He changed tactics, George whispered. He isn't set up ahead of us. He's trying to make us walk into a kill zone. Jensen looked around, panic rising. Where the hell would he shoot from? There's no high ground. George pointed at the jungle floor. That's the problem. This one's not in a tree. Before Jensen could respond, a single shot tore through the air, snapping past his left ear and exploding against a tree trunk behind him. Jensen flinched hard, dropping to the ground. George didn't move. He was already rotating, tracking the echo of the shot, every ounce of his attention tuned to micro details. The brief puff of disturbed leaf litter, the faint heat shimmer of a muzzle flash, the scattering of startled birds rising from a patch of undergrowth farther downslope. He's prone, George said quietly. 20 yards. Maybe less. Jensen whispered, terrified. How do you know? Because that shot came upward. He's trying to kill us on the angle we'd least expect. Another shot cracked, this one striking a branch inches from George's head. Jensen grabbed George's sleeve. Sir, get down. George ignored the fear. He dropped into a crouch, not prone. Prone meant roots, mud, worse visibility. Instead, he pivoted behind a thick tree and waited. The jungle stilled again. Seconds passed. Then the underbrush rustled, just the faintest shift. That was enough. George rolled sideways, brought the Springfield up, and fired through a small opening between two banyan roots. The muzzle blast scattered a cloud of insects. A split second later, they heard a strangled gasp cut short. Silence. Jensen let out a shaky breath. That was insane. George rose slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. He made a mistake. What mistake? He fired twice. Good snipers never fire twice. George scanned the tree line again, but not with relief, with calculation. He wasn't underestimating his opponent. He was evaluating what kind of sniper they were dealing with. Come on, he said. The one we're tracking, the one killing Marines? That wasn't him. Jensen stopped. What do you mean? George shook his head. That was an ambush, sure. The real sniper is still ahead of us. His tone was calm, chillingly certain. and he knows we're coming. They resumed the advance, slower now, every footstep measured. The jungle shifted subtly as they penetrated deeper, less sunlight, thicker canopy, denser vines. The air became heavy with the smell of damp earth and something metallic like rust. Even Jensen felt it now, a presence, deliberate and patient. Whoever the real sniper was, he wasn't just skilled. He was hunting them. 100 meters in, the trail forked. One path dipped toward a swampy hollow. The other curved along a ridgeline choked with towering roots. Jensen pointed left. If I were him, I'd set up down there. Lots of shadows. George shook his head. No, shadows help hide movement. A pro chooses stillness. High ground. That ridge. Jensen hesitated. You think he wants us to go that way? George didn't blink. I think he's prepared for both. Instead of choosing a path, George stepped off the trail entirely, moving silently into the brush. Jensen followed reluctantly, flinching every time a branch snapped underfoot. Soon they were weaving through a maze of strangler figs and thorny vines, navigating contour instead of footsteps. George paused again. There, a strand of spider silk stretched unnaturally taut between two branches. A trip line, nearly invisible. Jensen leaned close and saw what it was connected to. A crude but deadly deadfall. A sharpened stake, suspended from the limb above, ready to drop through a person's chest. Jensen whispered he trapped the trail. George nodded. He's controlling the battlefield. This isn't a lone sniper acting on instinct. This is a hunter who sets patterns and waits for his prey to enter them. They disabled the trap and moved on, even more aware now that the man ahead wasn't improvising. He had built an entire killing ground. 10 minutes later, George froze again, this time for something even more subtle. No birds. Total silence. Jensen whispered nervously, "Is he watching us right now?" George raised the Springfield. He has been for at least the last mile. Jensen felt sweat roll down his spine. Then why hasn't he fired? George's voice was calm. Too calm. Because he's choosing the perfect shot. He's studying us just like we're studying him. Then he added something that made Jensen's stomach drop. And when he fires, it'll be at me. Jensen gripped his carbine tighter. Why you? Because I'm the only threat. George stepped forward another 3 paces. A shot cracked instantly. So fast Jensen barely heard the muzzle blast before the bullet tore through a broad fern exactly where George's head had been an instant earlier. George had already moved, ducking, rolling, snapping his rifle up in one impossibly smooth motion. There, he shouted. Left ridge, second ironwood tree. He fired once. The echo faded. No response. Jensen held his breath. Did you get him? George listened, eyes narrowing. No, he said. He repositioned before he fired. A shiver crawled up Jensen's spine. Then where is he now? George looked at the ridge, and then slightly behind them. He's flanking. George didn't waste a second. He grabbed Jensen by the collar and yanked him behind a fallen log, just as another shot split the air. Bark exploded where their heads had been. Jensen's heart slammed against his ribs. How does he move that fast? Jensen gasped. He's not moving fast, George said, scanning the foliage with razor-sharp focus. He's moving smart. He fired from the ridge to make us look uphill, then circled downslope while we were distracted. Another shot cracked, this one low, angled upward. A round whined past George's boot. He's closer now, George whispered. Much closer. Jensen pressed himself into the mud. Then he's going to kill us. No, George said. He thinks he's closing in for a clean shot. That means he'll expose himself. Just for a moment. Jensen swallowed. How do you know? Because that's what I would do. George kept low, studying the geometry of the terrain, the slope, the brush density, the shape of the roots. A professional sniper didn't just hide. He used the landscape like a partner. George had spent years learning how professionals thought, operated, breathed. He spotted it. A small cluster of ferns. Undisturbed except for one, slightly compressed, angled in a way gravity alone wouldn't cause. Something had pushed against it recently. Jensen, George whispered, when I move, stay down. No matter what. What are you about to? George didn't answer. He slid silently out of cover, circling wide through a gap between two massive roots. He moved low, body hugging the terrain the way the Japanese sniper expected him to rise and scan. A heartbeat later, a third shot rang out, fired at the log Jensen hid behind. The sniper had committed. George was already sprinting. He burst from the brush like a ghost, closing the distance in a low, controlled charge. And there, 15 yards ahead, he saw him at last. The Japanese sniper lay prone behind a natural spider leg of banyan roots, his rifle still smoking, his eyes widening in shock as he realized he'd targeted the wrong man. George didn't shoulder his Springfield. He didn't need to. He fired from a hip. The 30-06 round slammed into the sniper's shoulder, flipping him sideways. The enemy tried to roll behind a root, dragging his rifle with his good arm, but George was already on him. The Japanese soldier raised his pistol for a last-ditch shot. George struck it aside and pinned him with a knee. The sniper gasped, bleeding heavily yet still defiant, fingers trembling as they reached for a hidden knife. George locked his wrist. For a moment, they simply stared at one another. Two men who had spent hours anticipating each other's every thought. The Japanese sniper whispered something George couldn't understand, but he recognized the tone. Respect. Then his hand went limp. George exhaled shakily. Sweat mixed with mud streaked down his face. Jensen approached slowly, stunned. "Sir, is it over?" George checked the ridge, the trees, the angles, listening for one more shot. "Nothing. It's over," he said softly. But then his expression hardened. "Except..." This wasn't the only sniper. Jensen froze. "What do you mean?" George pointed to the enemy's rifle. "This man's not the hunter killing our Marines." Jensen stared at him. "Then who was this?" George stood, wiping mud from his palms. This one was waiting for that sniper too. He looked deeper into the jungle, eyes narrowing. The real one is still out there. George and Jensen remained crouched behind the fallen log, the humid jungle pressing in on all sides. Every leaf, every broken branch, every twitch of shadow could conceal the next attack. George's breathing was steady, controlled, every muscle primed, every sense stretched to the maximum. Jensen, on the other hand, trembled slightly, gripping his carbine like a lifeline. "The real sniper," George murmured, scanning the slope ahead. "He isn't sloppy. He's methodical. He's watching us watch him, and he knows we'll make mistakes." Jensen swallowed hard. "So what we do now? We just wait." George shook his head. "No, we move. Carefully. But we do not chase him. He will come to us. Or we make him commit a move that exposes him." They advanced slowly, using every trick George had learned from years of hunting in forests far removed from war. Shadow masking, staggered footfalls, eye contact with the environment instead of the enemy. Every step measured, every rustle accounted for. Minutes felt like hours. Then George froze. "Right side, 30 yards," he whispered. Jensen barely saw the flicker of movement before George raised his Springfield. Through a tangle of vines, the tip of a rifle barrel protruded, catching the sunlight for an instant. The real sniper had made his first revealing move. George squeezed the trigger. A muted report cracked through the jungle. The figure jerked violently, then disappeared into the undergrowth. "He moved," Jensen whispered, panic rising. "Of course he moved," George said calmly. "He's baiting us." "But we know where he started." George pivoted, scanning rapidly. Every branch, every vine, every shadow was a potential threat. His eyes caught a faint imprint in the mud, footwear barely visible against the jungle floor, angled away from the trail. Someone had slipped out, tried to reposition silently. "Watch the ridge," George said. "He'll try to take the high ground." Jensen flinched as another shot rang out, barely missing George's head by inches. He flinched again. "He's too fast." "He's everywhere." George shook his head slowly. "No, he's not everywhere. He's in one place, and we just haven't figured out which one yet. But he will commit. He always does." The two men moved again, inching through the dense jungle. George kept his Springfield raised, scanning, listening. The silence of the forest was deceptive, pregnant with tension, with unseen intent. Then George spotted it, a tiny shadow where none should be, a leaf moving in impossible isolation. The Real sniper, finally exposing himself. George whispered, almost to himself, now. He crouched low, sighted carefully, and fired a single, precise shot. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The echo of the rifle bounced off the ridges, and then the shadow collapsed. Jensen exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. That's him. George's expression didn't soften. He approached the figure cautiously, scanning the area. Yes, that's him. But mark my words. He wouldn't have done it if the other wasn't gone. Jensen looked confused. The other? George knelt beside the downed sniper, checking for movement. There was always a second. We just neutralized the main one. The second is either observing or lying in wait. He stood, eyes narrowing into the jungle. This isn't over until we secure the ridge completely. Jensen swallowed, nodding grimly. He realized the forest wasn't just a battlefield. It was a chessboard. And George was thinking 5 moves ahead. George moved forward cautiously, every step calculated. The fallen sniper lay unconscious but alive, cradled partially by the tangled roots of a banyan tree. George scanned the ridge above, noting every shadow and every shift in the canopy. The second sniper had to be there. He couldn't have retreated entirely. Not a professional, not after the first shot had been fired. Jensen followed silently, clutching his carbine as if it were a lifeline. Sweat ran down his face, but he forced himself to move steadily. "Sir, what do we do now?" he whispered. George didn't answer immediately. His eyes were trained on a slope where sunlight cut through the dense jungle, illuminating patches of undergrowth. "We make him commit," George said finally. "He's waiting for us to make a mistake, and we won't. Not one." They advanced another 100 feet. George paused at a small clearing where the trail widened slightly. His instincts screamed that the sniper was observing, waiting for them to enter an exposed position. The silence was unbearable, punctuated only by distant bird calls that seemed unnaturally loud. Then, a small movement caught George's eye, a ripple of leaves, almost imperceptible, 25 yards up the slope. His heart rate didn't rise. His breathing didn't change. He had anticipated this. Slowly, he adjusted his Springfield, aiming just above a cluster of ferns that masked the enemy. Another shot cracked from above. The bullet thudded into a tree directly behind George and Jensen, sending splinters scattering. Jensen froze, wide-eyed. George whispered, "There." He fired, and he's overconfident. With a single fluid motion, George pivoted, fired 3 controlled rounds into the bush, and then rolled to a shallow ditch for cover. Seconds later, he heard the rustle of movement. The second sniper had reacted, breaking concealment. Jensen stared in disbelief. He moved? How did you see him?" George's eyes were cold, unblinking. Patterns, timing, angle of fire. He's predictable when he thinks he's invisible. That's the mistake we exploit. Another controlled shot, and a faint grunt indicated the sniper had been hit. George remained vigilant, scanning for any further movement. Check the surrounding ridges. He may have dragged himself to cover. Jensen moved quietly, inspecting the area while George continued scanning the slope above. It was painstaking, nerve-wracking work, but George's meticulous, methodical approach kept them alive. He knew the jungle's tricks and the sniper's mindset intimately. Every movement, every breath, every sound was data to be interpreted, calculated, and acted upon. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, George signaled Jensen. "He's neutralized. The ridge is clear for now, but stay alert. There may be more." Jensen nodded, chest heaving. "Sir, you're unreal." George allowed himself a brief exhale, but didn't relax. "I'm not unreal. I just read the environment and the enemy better than most. That's all." He turned his attention back to the ridge, scanning, listening, and already calculating their next steps. In the jungle, complacency was death, and George had no intention of dying today, or letting any Marine under his watch fall. By mid-afternoon, the ridge was secure. George and Jensen had methodically cleared the trail, neutralizing the sniper threat and ensuring that the supply route for the Marines was safe, at least for now. The sun had risen high, casting shafts of light through the dense canopy, illuminating the battered but determined men. Every branch and leaf seemed to glint with tension, as if the jungle itself had been holding its breath. George surveyed the path they had taken. Blood, broken foliage, and the subtle signs of a predator were everywhere, but so was the proof of their survival. He knew the significance. Each step, each decision had been critical. One miscalculation and the enemy snipers could have decimated the unit's movement along the supply line, slowing reinforcements and risking countless lives. Jensen, exhausted and muddy, glanced at George. "Sir, I don't think anyone would have survived that without you." George shook his head, lowering his Springfield, but not relaxing. "It wasn't just me. Observation, patience, understanding the terrain, that's how people survive. And knowing your enemy better than they know you." The downed snipers lay where they had fallen, neutralized but a stark reminder of the peril the Marines faced daily. George moved among them briefly, checking for weapons or signs of additional threats. Every detail mattered. One overlooked clue could mean disaster. As they finally made their way back toward the main encampment, George noticed the subtle signs of other troops moving cautiously through the undergrowth. Word of the sniper's elimination would travel quickly. Dinjan's supply lines, momentarily threatened, were now secure again thanks to his intervention. Jensen exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders. "I don't think anyone's going to mess with this trail again." George didn't answer immediately. His eyes swept the jungle one last time, assessing, calculating. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but the jungle always holds more. Always. Still, for now, the immediate danger had passed." George had done more than neutralize enemy snipers. He had demonstrated that understanding the environment, anticipating an opponent, and keeping calm under relentless pressure could turn certain death into survival. As they returned to the camp, the other Marines stared in awe. George had single-handedly cleared a deadly threat that could have disrupted operations and cost lives. Yet he remained calm, almost detached, as though what he had done was merely routine. But in the minds of everyone who watched, the reality was clear. A single man with discipline, patience, and skill had altered the outcome of that day in the Pacific. The sniper threat had been neutralized, supply lines preserved, and lives saved, all because George had refused to act like everyone else expected him to. In the end, it wasn't luck, not weapons, not orders. It was understanding, observation, and relentless precision. That day, the jungle had tested the Marines, and one man had answered its challenge and won.